I was one of the last guys to see Admiral Rickover in 1980. At the end of the year there. He brought all the nuclear submarine candidates, or nuclear power candidates to him, and we went in pairs. And so my pair guy got called up about 9:30 in the morning. We never saw him before. So then it was my turn to get interviewed, and I got to meet Admiral Rickover. He's behind his credenza in his office, just a disheveled old geezer. He needed a haircut, but I didn't tell him that. Bright blue eyes, just, Berg, what's your problem? You're average. You're not very big, you're not very small, you'll always be average. What's your grandmother's maiden name? I said, sir, I don't know. You don't know anything, get out of here. So the guy behind me grabs me by my collar, yanks me out of my chair, throws me out the door. He says, you're in. So they had done all their prep work. They just wanted to see if they could gas me or scare me or something. But that guy that grabbed my collar then was my first XO on USS Kingman. So that was my Rickover story. You go figure. But it was an experience and a half. So then at 7:30 at night, my pairing guy, he comes down the steps crying. I was in a closet since 9:30. They put him in a closet for, 8 hours. Just to intimidate. A 4.0 econ major. So he wasn't an engineering major, he was an economics major. But he went in and he had a great career in the Navy. So takes all kinds. So I'm a submarine force officer. I served a long time on 3 submarines, 1 shore tour, and served in the reserves. I got to command 5 reserve units in the local area here. And now I'm doing this. I'm a history minor historian, along with my son Andrew. We study stuff like this at the dinner table. My wife, our dinner conversations were awesome. It would be stuff just like we're going to cover today, except he would ask many more questions than I was able to answer. So let's talk about this. Steve asked me to talk about the B-24 as one of the primary components of the 8th Air Force. 8th Air Force Historical Society. It made sense to me. So there's one right there. Steve always asks me, did the B-24 have a ball turret on it? There it is. And on some of the paintings of the Ploesti raid, you don't see it. I don't know why. But this is a later version. This is either a J or an H with the snout gun on it there. The ones that flew in Ploesti, I think, were Ds with just a little 50 cal at the front of the nose. But let's get started here with some of this we're going to talk about. Okay, so design and U.S. Army specs. I'll go through some of that because I'm an engineer and I think it's interesting. And Jim asked me questions if you want to on some specs. Some cool stuff about the B-24, some operational history things. We'll go through a mission that I just could not believe that we did as a country. And then have a conclusion statement that someone can argue with me about, but I'm happy for that. So design specs, it started in 1938. Note that this is a spec that was actually created after the B-17 spec, which I think was in 1934. So the Type 299 B-17 was designed to a different spec that was way less than this specification here. So that was the spec that the B-24 was designed to, and the B-24 had a bunch of different things to enable this. So right out the box, the B-24 is not as pretty as the Golden Bird, right? I mean, that thing's just pretty. That looks pretty to me there. But look at the difference in the specs. B-17 slow. The range is now 3,000 miles instead of 1,000 miles. Pretty short range. The bomb load up here was enormous compared to a 2,000-pound bomb load. And the surface sea was 35,000 feet. Strangely enough, the B-24 never made that. As part of its airfoil and wing loading and all that, it couldn't get above 30,000 feet unless it was unloaded and had helium in it or something. But the comparison here is interesting, isn't it? And, part of the performance differences between the B-17 and the B-24 are because of this spec. Because Henry Ford and his cohort Edsel figured out how to make this spec into bombers in the Willow Run plant in Detroit. They started building that plant in 1941. It took them 2 years, and they started mass producing bombers, B-24s. We'll get into that later. And so there's some of the difference then was this is a design for mass assembly instead of a design for performance solely. Mary?
How did they go the 3,000 miles and what missions? Out of where? Europe would have not been nearly that far over and back.
Oh, right. Right, so the 3,000 miles, is a range, so it's out and back. Yeah, but it did have an enormous ferry range. It had a capacity for 3,600 gallons of gasoline. That's a lot of gas. Only in the pack. If we're doing a big ferry mission, typical ranges in Europe are 700 to 800 miles. So they traded off gas for bombs. We'll get into that. It's a great question. Hold that thought, Mary. And if you don't agree with my conclusion at the end of the day, I will have failed. All right, so this guy at Consolidated, he was a pretty smart guy. His name is Davis, and he came up with this airplane design. So that was a flying boat with 2 engines on it, with this really cool airfoil. It's a neat airfoil, and he named it after himself, I think. It was highly efficient. It was a fairly thick cord. I think this cord is vertical, Jim, right through this deep cord right here. So it's a very efficient airfoil that carried this big, ugly body around, kind of like my design. But this is the same stuff that they used on the Catalina then. And so the Catalina was built by Consolidated, hugely successful airframe, able to travel probably more than 3,000 miles and fly almost 24 hours fully loaded with gas. So the birth of the B-24 started with this design. You can kind of see some of the stuff that they just ripped off from this design and didn't have to redesign it because they just put it on the B-24, which again was not a very pretty airplane. So here's the design spec then. There's the first YBEX something or other. It's kind of pretty with a cute little snout on it there. The 4 engines then, these were not their final engines because they only produced something like 900 horsepower each, whereas the final version produced 1,200 horsepower and were turbo supercharged. But here's some good design stuff that came out of it. A huge range, very high top speed compared to the contemporary planes of its day, the B-17. Heavier bomb load, way heavier, a trike landing gear, so it had a little tail wheel. And the lead design was tremendous. It performed really well. It had a few drawbacks. Look at this top airspeed. So they almost met the 300 miles per hour. And so they did some work on that. And they just redesigned the engines. With Pratt & Whitney came up with the turbo supercharger that then boosted the performance and got them to 310. So that's good. The wingspan was larger than the B-17, but the wing area was smaller. In fact, the wing loading on a B-24 was 61 pounds force per square foot, which is really high. If you guys recall, let's see, if you ever go to the history roundtable, I did a presentation on Jimmy Doolittle. I mean, actually, he flew the B-26 Marauder, the Widowmaker, and the wing loading on that thing was 66 foot-pounds force per square feet. So highly wing-loaded, just like the B-24. So it's big. It's not insignificant in its design. This will be on the test. More stuff on the wing. Let's see. One thing that they didn't think about was icing. So in fact, the Davis wing, because it offered a huge low pressure area behind it, the deep cord on it, it formed ice. And so it was susceptible to ice and the resulting loss of lift, often catastrophic if you had it. And they mounted it in the shoulder. The smart people decided that was the best place to load it, and that helped to facilitate a unfettered bomb bay. So the bomb bay on this thing was humongous. It was twice the size of a B-17. So you can see here, the point of this photo is the shoulder wing, how thick it is. They put a lot of gas right up in this area here. So the center of lift is right over here. And that's where they put all the gas. So when they used up the gas, they didn't have to trim the airplane. Otherwise it'd be nose heavy or tail heavy. So that's where all the gas was. And you'll see what happens later on in the presentation. But there we are talking about the wing loading. I don't have a B-17 picture to compare it to because everyone has it indelibly etched in their minds anyways. B-24s, yeah. A drawback of the shoulder mount wing too was that when they crash landed, like this guy's doing here in progress, it tilted over to one side. So he probably hit the ground, and then when it slows down, without the wheels out, look at the flames coming out right there. It tips over to one side, and they had a lot of cartwheeling and ground looping because the wingtips would hit, and if there's any gas in there at all, the plane would go up. And so they've called this the flying coffin because the guys couldn't get out when they're up in the air because they had to jump off the bomb bay. So the tail gunner and all these guys had to run up here and jump out. So they didn't like that. And then when they hit the ground without any landing gear, it did this, a ground loop and caught fire. So not a good feature. There's a B-17 crash landing without wheels, and it's in good shape, isn't it? I'd rather be in that than a B-24 spinning around. I'd rather be in that. It was almost designed to do that. There's like a skid plate, where you have pickup trucks with skid plates on them. This thing I had unofficial reading once of a skid plate in there so it could protect the crew when they came in. Interesting. There's a B-24, look at all that gas going up. I don't know what aircraft could have survived a hit that did this to this airplane. But that's a ton of gas going up, isn't it? And look at the wings are splitting because it was really susceptible in this area here, where they join the wings to the fuselage. The wings are coming apart, the gas is going up, bombs are coming out. Horrible, just awful. But it was the cost of having an airplane mass produced in a war zone. And here's the engine. I like engines. Who does not like engines here? Right, Mary. Okay. Pretty neat stuff. Here's the turbo supercharger here. I was talking to Theo about that over that kid there, about the benefits of a turbo supercharger. And Jim knows that the turbo supercharger, and anyone who knows about P-47s as well, it's run off the exhaust gases instead of the crankshaft on the propeller. So at altitude, it could develop its design power. So these engines then, unsupercharged, like it was in the prototype, not very fast, didn't meet spec. Turbo supercharged, met spec, 1,200 horsepower each engine. So 12 times 4 is 4,800. So that's a lot of horsepower, and that's why these guys are so fast with that efficient data airfoil. You carry a lot of bombs really far with the gas that they put on board. There it is there. Mary, you won't have to draw that for the test. 5 different manufacturers, and here the most famous one, of course, is Willow Run here in Michigan. You always hear about what Henry Ford did, I think I talked about earlier. Matter of fact, they could do mass producing. They were doing cars there. So they built this factory from the ground up to build B-24s there. And the goal was to build one every 100 minutes, 7 days a week. And in fact, they were putting them out every 59 minutes. So that's a bomber an hour. And they built 8,600 of them. Interesting fact here that I came across. The mechanics in the field had to deal with 4 major variations and 4 sets of manuals. So anyone that's ever been in ops or production or anything like that, you produce what you think is the final assembly, and then you got to do modifications and rework to it to meet the new stuff that you're learning from your design that's outperforming, and they come in and they have to change the design. So 1,820 changes. That's a lot. So, I mean, this is what happens though during a really vibrant program, is that they learn what they liked about the B-24s and what they didn't like, and then fix it, and then try to do it in production so they wouldn't have to rework them after they built them. Consolidated had another big plant in San Diego. If you look at some, you can go out online, Consolidated plant, San Diego, they actually had to camouflage it. There's this really cool picture of a camouflaged factory making B-24s, and you can't tell it's a factory even. Just people walking into nothing. It's kind of neat. So they were still thinking we could get attacked, mainland USA, especially on the coast there in San Diego. Over 18,500 actually B-24s were built compared to just a few B-17s. And that is, quite frankly, the reason why there's more B-24s carried more tonnage to Europe than B-17s, because there's just more of them, because they could make more, even though the B-17s had a head start. Wasn't fair. There's the Willow Run plant right there, and these B-24s here are configured for the Navy version PBY-4, the coastal patrol and anti-submarine patrol aircraft. They're really good at it. Nice paint job. Look in the factory. They already got the paint job in the factory. The ones on this side, you can tell, are headed for Europe probably. These ones are headed for coastal regions to do anti-submarine patrols. Well, look at that factory. I mean, it goes way back in there. That's like a half mile. I mean, I can't barely run a half a mile anymore. It's way back there. And we pump one of these babies out every hour. Isn't that neat that we were able to do that? Here's some more cool stuff. The B-24J could fly faster with a heavier bomb load and a longer range than contemporary bombers of the period. Okay, the B-17s. But the cost was a more fragile wing structure, and it flew lower. Why is that important? Do you know what's bad about flying lower in a bomber over, say, anti-aircraft guns?
Flying lower?
Yeah, that worrisome for you? Yeah, they're easier to shoot down, and so that's what happened. So if they flew lower and were more susceptible to anti-aircraft fire, the 88s and the 105s that were just the radar guns. And yeah. No, well, yeah. You know, if you watch the Masters of the Air, when they jump out of the airplanes because they abandon aircraft, they don't pull a chute right away. They're falling because you can't breathe up there. Yeah. Some things to point out here are the green and the reds. Some of this data is weird because it would change based on gas and bomb loads. So I did the best I could to try to make my point. Stats can tell you whatever you want. But the max speed for the B-24J with those turbo supercharged engines, 313 versus a slower B-17. And it cruised at 215. And so when you look at photos of strategic strike photos, and you look at the aircraft that are doing the damage, they're never mixed, are they? There's never two B-17s and 6 B-24s. Nope. That's because the B-24 flew so much faster than the B-17s that you wouldn't want them flying that way. And so they didn't do that. But there's the lower altitudes that the B-24J could get to versus the B-17G. And then the bomb loads. Let's talk about that. And I'll show some demonstrations of evidence of what we're talking about here. Is that B-24s could carry about 8,000 pounds, typically, so 4 tons. And the B-17s could carry about 6,000 pounds. So a ton more per aircraft, per sortie than for the B-24s. And there's the 3,600 gallons of gas right there for the B-24s versus about 2,400 for that slower aircraft. And you can see the max takeoff weight. Oh my gosh. 71,000 pounds max takeoff weight. So that's like 35 and a half tons of aircraft taken off. That's just amazing to me. Mary?
When they were going over, you know, in mostly 44, 43, did they build the bomb group bases? Did they know where the 24s were going? Because obviously it had to be, the runway had to be a little bit different than 17s. Did they know that? Because they took over a lot of RAF airfields. So how did they know how to rebuild those airfields?
Yeah, great question. And I actually did some research on this last night. There was some guy there last night at Don's History Roundtable that knew that answer. And the answer is, they didn't build them differently. Matter of fact, they stamped them like cookie cutters into the countryside. All the control towers were the exact same spec. All the runways were the exact same azimuth because of the prevailing winds, so they all look the same. Yeah, so you can go over there today, Thorpe Abbott looks just like Wembley, looks just like all these North Wheel, all look the same. That's my answer for you, Mary. They may have been different for these different platforms, but they had them built before they arrived, obviously, but they knew what was coming. They did know that much. Look at these stats, though. These are just enormous planes. They would fill up this. One of them would fill up this room here, probably, with all that stuff. And it would smell like engines. It'd be great. Turbo supercharger. This will be on the test. No numbers, just arrows is what I would require. And so the turbo supercharger, which is really important, with the air density going down and the turbo air going up, power stayed the same. So at altitude, B-24 engines could develop 1,200 horsepower per spec. Again, terrible stuff. There's that wing, susceptible to battle damage because of the high wing loading. Let's talk about some missions then that these B-24s did. What's the most famous B-24 mission for 10 points?
Ploesti.
Ploesti, right here. What was Ploesti, Jim?
Well, the oil manufacturing for the Allies, but the Germans wanted it for their side. Romania?
Yeah, it's in Romania. So oil manufacturer, you can see the refinery looking stuff there. And there's a B-24D, I think, with the snout guns on it. Hugely famous mission. You can read about it online. It's so interesting. Well planned, poorly executed. Because the guys, they got lost. The navigators got lost. And eventually they put one, they went after like 5 of the refineries, Concord, Vega, and some of these other ones. They put one out of business for the whole war. And they reduced output by, I don't know, 50% on this rate alone. But again, the ability of the Axis then to repair these required repeat visits. But these guys came out of Benghazi. So Benghazi's south of Albert Lee. Look at these Norwegians going. So it's way south, it's in Africa. So they had to do a huge inbound ingress over the Mediterranean Ocean. They got lost, but they could see the flames coming up in the distance, and they did the best they could. But it caused them some casualties because they didn't come in a group, and so they couldn't, that would have divided the anti-aircraft fire and the fighter fired, and so they came in at all different times and basically got more casualties than they needed to.
I'll tell that story if you want to.
Go.
The lead navigator for that Ploesti raid lived about 3/4 of a mile from where we are right now. He lived on the southeast corner of Lindale and 98th Street, and I took him to several events. The problem was the 9th Bomber Command that was based in Benghazi was painted with the desert tan. But there were 3 bomb groups that came down from the 8th Air Force that were painted with the green. The original sand-colored B-24s were actually originally slated to go to China. They were actually going to be joining up with it was called the Halverson Project. And they flew down across from South America into Africa. They got as far as Egypt. And they were actually going to meet up in China with the Doolittle B-25s at a base in China. But of course, the B-25s in China didn't make it, so they stopped these here. They flew several missions with the two bomb groups. And then when they decided to do this August 1st, it was called Operation Tidal Wave. They sent 3 bomb groups down from the 8th Air Force. The 8th Air Force bombers were a newer version. They could go up to higher altitude. The 2 that were originally with the 9th Bomber Command couldn't. And so when they came in over Corfu and made their turn into the mainland, there was some weather, and the bomb groups from the 8th Air Force flew over it. These flew through it, and so they came out in different formation on the far side of it. God, I have to tell you, I have to look at this again. This guy gave me all of his flight papers from this mission. I've got those with my book called Ploesti, which was actually written by a guy from Minnesota. And it's one of the most fascinating missions that I've ever studied. And we had a bunch of Ploesti guys that lived here in Minnesota.
Thanks, Don, for that anecdote. Pretty amazing, too. What he talked about is illustrated in this painting here. There's the sand-colored paint scheme. Maybe that one is, but here's one of the plants. So plus they had like 5 oil refineries in them. There's one, and then there's one over here. So kind of an interesting painting. Tells a little bit of the story.
What altitude are they at?
I would say,
Looks like about 100 feet there. They were low. They were low, yeah.
yeah, we'd lower the periscope, that's all I can say. There's another view of that. Again, you can see the shoulder wing back in here. It's kind of why I put that up there. Again, 2 distinct plants. They're getting out of there. They're at low level. I don't see any ball turrets, Steve, on these ones.
It's in a shadow.
Yeah, and very interesting painting, though, isn't it? It tells a lot. Battle damage happening, feathered engines. A lot of planes went down because of battle damage. There's the real-life strike photo of Ploesti there. Same with that one. Yeah, and look at these pipes here. Oh my gosh, these guys are pretty courageous, flying through that, knowing that they had that. Jim.
I think the interesting thing about the Ploesti raid is that the 2 formations had taken off initially from different places, and when the second wave got to their turning point to head in on final approach to Ploesti, they missed that checkpoint, and they flew on and they turned off when the lead navigator recognized his mistake, and they turned off at the second checkpoint. They found themselves flying into the B-24s from the first wave that were now flying out of Ploesti. So the second wave, rather than sighting on targets, they had to avoid the aircraft that they were flying into.
And that was because they were supposed to turn on a railroad junction, and they did the wrong junction because planes they weren't 5
The other
bomb
thing that I want to
formations.
mention, they try to say that, you know, it was one target of Felicity, but actually there was 4 targets. There was 4 different refineries that were scheduled to be attacked, and one of the refineries that they were supposed to bomb was not attacked at all. But, there were many, many raids after that. My father flew the last raid, or one of the last raids at Felicity, back around, I believe it was August 18th of 1944. So that target was attacked by his bomb group quite a few times.
Yeah, and it was a tough target to hit. It was just a long flight in, rife with navigational problems, as we've talked about here. And there's like 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 missions.
That was his first mission. He said by that time, his first mission was Pulaski, and by that time, the targets had been pretty well chewed up, and there was, you know, the Germans had already pulled along their defenses out of there. So he said that was basically a cakewalk. That first raid was you know, not a real tough mission for him.
Thank you. Yeah, awesome. Personal anecdote right here. Can't beat it.
Everything was great for the first shot.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm not saying these guys didn't do their job. Yeah, they did an enormous job. And like Jim was saying, I mean, they're flying into each other and trying to navigate over unknown territory. No thanks.
When you talk about targets, my father flew 35 missions in the 15th Air Force, and you know, another tough target that was a refinery that was never mentioned was Bloomington, which was a synthetic oil plant. It was attacked many times by different bomb groups, but I remember there was another gentleman here that was in the 15th Air Force that was in one of the rare ones that was a flew 17s, and he said they also bombed that, and it was a tough target. Bloomington was another.
When they had 4 targets, how did they determine which formation would hit which target?
Yeah, so that was all planned. And that's like this gentleman was saying, they didn't hit them all. Yeah, in the confusion, I think they were high enough actually to tell. And like they just studied all the sand tables. These guys are smart and smart. So they could see what was going on. Oh, there's one that hadn't get hit. We're going to drop over there, I think. I can't remember the after action on this one exactly. I have another one to talk about. Oh yeah. I think they did their best, and they did hit, they took one totally out. The rest of them were, I mean, look what they're doing. And the weapon of choice is a 500-pound bomb. Anyone ever try to lift up 500 pounds? It's enormous. And these guys carried a lot of them, so they did some damage.
Planning and execution are not the same thing.
No, planning and execution are not the same thing, but everyone that's prepared, like Boy Scouts, if something else happens, okay, what's plan B look like? And so these guys are smart. They probably already thought about this. It never made it to the history books about, hey, Vega's already, we're going to go up to Concord. And so that all came out. And I didn't study Ploesti and it's as intensely as I should have. But they did some damage to it, but they still had to go back.
Who would have done the briefing so they knew what it looked like and all that? I mean, you look at the movies and they're doing the briefing that morning, but certainly they must have done put more research into it.
Yeah, good question, Mary. So on Masters of the Air, episode, I think 7 it is, the main navigator, Harry Crosby, he gets promoted to be the group navigator. They show all those guys doing all the mission planning, and they're like bleeding through their eyeballs. They're working so hard without sleep to try to get the mission preps ready to go, so that brief that happens at 4 a.m. is complete. So it's not like they're winging it. I mean, this was hours and hours and hours of pictures and for one mission. Yeah.
You didn't sleep for 4 days.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think they had mock-ups in the desert that practiced flying over to.
I forget your first name.
Dan.
Dan brings up a good point. They actually did have a Ploesti mock-up built in the desert near Benghazi, and they flew missions on it. And like 2 or 3 days before the real mission, the general was down there in charge and did the after-action review of the fake Ploesti, and they took it out. they just wiped it off the face of the earth. She goes, these boys are ready. But like we're saying, bad weather, railroad tracks all look the same from, 20,000 feet, whatever. Bullets cause the plans to get redone. Next painting here is an encounter with the ME-262. Why is that significant? It's a jet. You couldn't shoot at it with the 50 caliber guns. The turrets wouldn't track them. They show them shooting. These guys had 30 millimeter cannons, 4 of them on the front. They just saw wings off. Hard to shoot down. P-47s did it all the time. P-51s only occasionally. Over the Alps, they came out in I think November '44 is when they first started flying as a squadron. First against a Mosquito recon plane that didn't get shot down. But I just think it's interesting that these guys designed to a 1938 spec, 7 years later or 6 years later, were flying against jets and still doing okay. Something else the B-24s did, they carried the Special Operations Forces from a special base in England. They're the carpetbaggers, yeah. And there's the guys jumping out. It looks like down there.
What's the name of that Bob? What's his last name? Holmstrom. Yeah, he's here once in a while. And he was on at Oshkosh.
Okay. Yeah, the carpetbaggers, they painted them black. They were a special base. You couldn't get near them. Look at the red lights on the inside. There's a submariner, I get that. We did that too at night. And they dropped missions, and sometimes they picked them up too if they could land. So special pilots, special plane, moons out, kind of neat. And then there's the anti-submarine patrol that we talked about earlier. Looks like a U-boat, depth charge going off, B-24 doing its job.
And the Navy also had a variant that had a T-tail rather than
Yeah, it was called the Privateer. Had a big, huge boat, B-17-like tail on it. They used them over in the Pacific, generally. Okay, what's important about this photo? Anybody pick that out? Dual bomb bays, right. And each one as big as a fortress. But what's of note here, that these are 500-pound bombs. So if you do the math, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 pounds, which was its standard loadout. Whereas the B-17 standard loadout was 4,000 pounds. So here's an example of a fully loaded Liberator doing damage with 500-pound bombs out of dual bomb bays. And look at the ball turret's tucked in there, Steve. They cranked it up. So he's in there. Yeah. They carry 10 guns. This one is probably a J or an H. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 bombs away.
Do the bomb bays open simultaneously or one and then the other? Or do they open altogether?
I don't know that answer. All I know is that 2 of them are open here because that bomb bay was humongous, and it's dropping 3,000 pounds from the front one and 3,000 pounds from the back one. Good question. It could carry up to 12,900 pounds of bombs, so that wasn't even its big loadout. But that's what they did typically to get to where they got to go. 800 mile range.
And the bomb bays are like a roll top desk.
Yes. You can see they didn't open up like the slower plane. They open up like this. These ones rolled up like
Into the play.
No, you can see them right there. You can see the roll. They would roll up and over.
Oh.
So,
On the outside?
yeah. What's the advantage of that is no aerodynamic drag because the doors aren't flopping in the, like Jim's B-25. One of his big scary things is open up that bomb bay door because they would rattle. Okay, these ones wouldn't. I mean, they may have rattled, but they were aerodynamically efficient. Okay, so we talked about how come you can, how do you shoot down a B-24? So this is a quick diagram of anti-aircraft fire versus fighter fire versus other losses. So anti-aircraft did a lot of damage. And you can see here in 45, the fighters didn't come up. When Doolittle took over, he listened to his guys. His guys said, why am I flying my P-47 at altitude with the big bombers? Why am I flying with them? I can't do my job. And if I have to stay with them, I can't follow them and shoot them down. Jimmy Doolittle says, okay, we're changing that. We're using the bombers as bait. And you fighter guys, fly up over here. So when you see the bad guys coming, you can have the speed and height advantage and go get the fighters. Because why? Who knows why that was important?
D-Day.
D-Day. So we wanted aerial superiority. And to do that, we had to coax the fighters up, the German fighters up off the ground so our fighter planes could shoot them down. And that's what Jimmy Doolittle knew that and changed tactics as soon as he took charge, my kind of guy. Except he's only this tall. So it'd be a good date for you, Mary. Just saying. And so you can see the relative what happened here. Lots of anti-aircraft fire damage in 44, and the accident rate huge.
So my question is,
Compared to the B-17, which could take a beating, what's the comparison as, taking a beating here and they went down as to the 17s who could, get that?
Yeah, so the B-24 was less robust of a design than the B-17. If you look at the actual shoot-down ratio per sortie, B-17 is actually higher than the B-24. Even though the B-24 was fragile compared to, the reason for that is there was a ton more B-24 sorties. So there's more B-24s out there. They built 18,500 B-24s and only 1,200 B-17s. 12,000, sorry. So that's 50% more. And so I'm not surprised by that statistical stat. But stats can tell you anything you want them to say. So I tried to find that exact question, answer to that question. I couldn't find it anywhere. I was even looking for it this morning. That's why I was here at 11 and not 10:30. I couldn't find it. I could not find it. I was on the 8th Air Force side, everything. I couldn't find how many B-24s got shot down and why. So I just have a general big bomber shoot down stat. So let's talk about Gotha. Gotha was a city that housed a production plant for twin-engine German fighter planes. And we needed to take care of that town with a bunch of B-24s. Why I bring this up? Because this is a great microcosm of every mission that the B-24s would fly. What's of note here? The group has 32 bombers and 384 500-pound general purpose bombs. That's a lot of tonnage of bombs. Only 32 planes attacked this target. They hit the Dutch coast, and for an hour and a half, they were being beset by 100 to 150 single and twin engine planes throwing the kitchen sink at them. Look what they're doing to them. Air cannons, rocket fire, and even cable-type bombing. Anybody heard of cable-type bombing, Jim? I just came upon it in the last couple of days. I think what they would do is an advanced version of the blimps with the aerial cables hanging on them, right? So they'd fly above the bomber stream and drop cables with bombs attached to them and try to, hang them up on the wings and stuff. That's pretty creative. I just found that out this morning, actually. I'm going, what? So I tried to look up exactly what that is. No hits on the internet on what cable bombing was. Did your dad run into it? Never hear of it? Anyways, they pulled out the kitchen sink is the point of this. And then we claimed 21 enemy aircraft shot down. Again, just nuts getting to the target. So here's their flight path. They got to get to Gotha. So they're not pointing right at it after takeoff. They come in here. You can see the escorts they had. So there's Holland. There's a Zyder Z there. So they had P-47s providing escort service. P-51s, only not so much. Come over here, there's the IP to Gotha, bombs away. P-38s came after they got out of the flak fields there, and then came back up in here. Spitfires actually right up. Why would they do that? Why would they stage the fighters like that? Range. They also needed to have gas for dogfighting. So they could have probably, P-51s could probably do the whole shooting match here, but they would have to be on idle settings and not have enough gas to fight the enemy. So here's the results of the Battle of Gotha on 24 February. This is just awesome to me. They lost a lot of guys doing it. And we'll cover that in a little bit here. They dropped 317 of those bombs within a 1,000-foot radius of the briefed aiming point. That's pretty good. 1,000 feet? How many people have been in your house at home and there's a caterpillar a couple blocks away doing caterpillar stuff? And your house is shaking like a leaf, isn't it? At least mine is. They're dropping these 500-pound weapons within 2,000 feet and 1,000 feet of the aim point. Good on them. Good on us guys. Dorton bomb site. Pretty good stuff there. 24 buildings of this Gauthier wagon fabric plant completely destroyed and 11 almost destroyed. I don't know what almost means. And then, but they took it out basically. And we lost 7 planes doing it. I think it's interesting that the high block section of 11 aircraft would be the heaviest hit by fighters, losing 6 of their bombers and 1 in the Purple Heart corner position. I think that's an interesting comment. So the point of this slide is we knocked the heck out of that plant with just 32 planes. A couple of them turned back. They took some losses, but the bombing results were such that the 322nd Bomb Group won the Presidential Distinguished Unit Citation. Didn't see a whole lot of those in my reading. So good on them guys. There they are. Over Gotha, there is some 500-pounders heading down. So there should be how many? 16 of them, maybe? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So 12, yeah, 6,000 pounds. So there's 6,000 pounds of bombs headed towards the Gotha plant making twin-engine bombers. And there's a post-strike analysis by pictures of the aim point. Look at that. That's darn good. I don't know what the circles represent, but I know what that represents. And if this is 1,000 and this is 2,000, that's half a mile. Knowing what damage 500-pound bombs do, not personally, but I can imagine, I would say we did a good job on that one. Isn't that a neat picture though? I found that one. Oh, I gotta show that. Okay, and here is the 392nd Bomb Group. That's the lead plane there with the general on board. He flew the strike right there. These guys in this kind of configuration, they aborted. So we had 4 abortions, so 28 planes flew. And these guys here with the hatch marks on, those are the shoot downs. This is the front group. This is the high side group. So they flew high, medium, and low. These are the high side groups. And here's the Purple Heart corner right there. No, sure enough, they got shot down. Why is that important? Why do you think the high side group got attacked first? Why did the high side group get attacked first?
The fighters were attacking from altitude.
The fighters were attacking from altitude. Right on. So here it is here. There's the high side group there. This is the tail view. And so the fighters would come down, and these guys would be vulnerable to a higher attack like that. There's the lead plane there with the general on board. And here's the tail end Charlie, Purple Heart corner. Sure enough, he got hit and he got whacked. And here's the tail end Charlie positions then. So those guys are vulnerable because the planes coming from astern of the formation would get these guys first. That makes sense. They also came from high side and in the front. So There's the high side group there. So you can see why the high side would be most vulnerable. You're right on the money there.
Larry Bachman was in 392nd. Now I don't know if he was on that mission or not.
Larry Bachman, that's the second time I've heard of him today. Steve brought him up earlier to me, I think, yeah. Anyways, I thought that's interesting. So this is the formation, this is the results that the formation did. And, oh my gosh, wouldn't that tick you off if the plane above you had bombed you? But again, if you look at this diagram, if you're dropping bombs, you can see they're spread out. And even here, you can see that if you did your job and flew where you're supposed to fly, you're not going to get hit by bombs. I could never figure that out until I got these two diagrams together. You know, it seemed to me that all these planes would be bombing each other, but they were spread out. You can also see why there was a 2,000-foot circular error probability, because they were spread out pretty much. So if this bombardier is dropping, everyone's dropping on this lead bombardier's pickle, you can see where there would be a dispersion of that. And we came west to east, so you can see where that makes sense. I thought I'd put that up there just for some tactical sense of what our guys were doing. I think that's pretty neat. And that's a Brit plane. We sold some to the Brits too. And here's my conclusion. I won't read it. Except for these bullets here. Key player, the B-24 helped to destroy the Luftwaffe and the German war industries. And in the pack, I didn't talk about the Pacific use much. It was long-range, small plane raids. So just a squadron or two was generally what they did instead of 1,000 plane range like they did in England. And then the anti-submarine patrols were not inconsequential. To keep the submarines underwater during the day so they couldn't attack our merchant shipping. So my total conclusion here, Mary, is that without the B-24, World War II would have had a different outcome. Yep. Yep. Yeah, because the B-17 we couldn't make enough B-17s, and this plane was faster, more bombs, farther. Yeah. It's all of that wing. The wing was a blessing and a curse. It was very efficient, but it was weak.
I understand that the pilot workload in a B-24 was much more difficult than
Yes.
B-17.
Yeah, the pilot workload in a B-24 was enormous. Yeah. Yeah. In fact, normal Army guys couldn't do it. They made them be ground pounders. And they got a lot of Navy guys over that had these huge guns on them to fly the B-24s.
One thing my father mentioned was, he was a bombardier, but he said the only time he didn't fly the 24 was when it was taking off or landing. He used to give the pilots relief because it was so hard to fly. And he had over 100 hours, or he had right around 100 hours when he went into bombing training. So, I think that's why he's picked to fly with the major that was a squadron commander that he flew with, because he had so many hours.
Yeah, not easy to fly. Good point. Good point, Dan. Any other comments? Open for questions. I'm done here.
I'm going to tell a story. Somebody's going to have to help.
What was the name of the artist that did the Doodle Raid? He was part of taking people over to New Guinea and finding crash sites. Brian Moon. I had Brian Moon speak in probably our second or so year of the round table. He went over to China and he did a picture of a B-25 flying, and he went over to China and he found some B-25 crash sites, which he said were Doolittle planes, and he put a piece of a B-25 on all his prints. Well, he also did a Ploesti tidal wave, and we had developed a friendship. He came into my office one day and said, "Hey, what do you think about this for the tidal wave print?" And I pointed out to him the point I made earlier, that some of them had green, some of them had desert sand. He said, I should have known that. Anyway, he went over to Pulaski. He found a couple of crash sites. And so of his 300 or so prints, he had a piece of what he said was a B-24. It could have been from other missions. But bless his heart, one day a big box showed up at my office, and I have one of his prints, one of his artist proofs, with a piece of supposed B-24 from that. But he did some wonderful work. Brian Boone was a real treasure here locally.
I think Northwest guy.
Thanks, Don. We do have somebody here today that needs to talk about B-24s and his family's involvement in flying B-24s. Army Sergeant Rick.
This is all impromptu. I wasn't expecting this. I just showed up with some stuff on my family's history, and that's about it. So, first of all, my father-in-law was in the 8th Air Force 2nd Bombardment Division. He was like one of the admin people. So when I told my wife I was coming today, she dug through her files. Her and her mom put together 2 3-inch binders of all his facts and histories and photos from World War. Put them together from World War II. Got like 2 3-inch binders of photos and histories and orders. And this is my father-in-law, Pete Mulvaney. And then it's got his orders, his registration certificate on the bottom. And he was overseas in England for about 2.5 years. And then this one is, like I said, my wife has got probably 500 pages of this stuff. This is a copy of a citation that his unit got from General Doolittle for the mission. It's dated 6th of May, 1945. And it's for the work they did in Europe at that time. And then my father-in-law was from Peoria, Illinois, and I'm sure you've all heard of the Witchcraft, the B-24 bomber that did 100 missions. It's a picture of my father-in-law, Pete, with the pilot of the Witchcraft. And then on the bottom is a picture of me in front of the new Witchcraft. So the first one is probably 1944, 45, and the bottom one is me in Chester, Virginia, when I took it out there in about 2017 or 18. So, and then my father was, he wanted to be a pilot, but he didn't have the brains enough to be a pilot. So they made him a tail gunner. And this is a picture of my dad when he graduated from gunnery school in 1944 or 45, I think it was. And then part of the training my dad did was actually go up in the B-24s and fly around and probably shoot weapons out the back end, whatever. And this is his flight log from December of 1944 that he got while he was in training. It tells the tail number of the plane he was on, how many hours he flew on this and that. Then I've got miscellaneous orders from my dad's files. This one's assigning him to gunnery school, and one of them was assigning him somewhere else in gunnery school. I don't have a clue where. But he spent 16 to 17 months in training just to be a tail gunner. And I marked on the map where he went. He started out in Florida, went to all over the southeast, out to California, out to Colorado, back to Florida. He spent like 15,000 miles on a train going back and forth across country for his training. He spent like 15, 16 months in training. And at the end of the war, he was training to be a remote gunner in the B-29. So when the war ended, he was in training to be a B-29 gunner. And then he got out in 46, went back in 1947, did 24 more years, retired as a lieutenant colonel on the chief of staff at USARPAC in Hawaii. And then my history, for whatever it's worth, is I did 14 years in the Guard, 28 years active, and retired as a sergeant major in 2011. And that's my story, and we're just wanted to say something.
Thank you for your service.
relative. Do you want B-24?
Yes.
Ruth,
Oh, do
tell
I
me
want the
this story.
microphone? You guys did this to me last time I came in here.
She's gonna stop coming.
Oh, she brought pictures.
No, not that I'm gonna start, because I think it's such an important story, and I love hearing other people's experiences and connecting with my uncle's story. I'll give a quick little, yes, he was my uncle was a,
This is Ruth Holman, by the way.
that's a good way to start. Who am I? Where did I come from? And where has my uncle's story taken me? And Don Patton is part of that story. He keeps pulling me back in.
Bugging you.
Bugging me, pulling me back in, honoring my uncle's memory, his story. So my uncle was a pilot of a B-24. He was part of the 15th Air Corps just as it was starting. So his experience in Italy was in 1943. He flew very few missions before his plane crashed. And he and 9 other soldiers were killed, and 2 were POWs. So I have carried my uncle's story. He was the older brother of my mom. I have carried my uncle's story forever. I don't even know when it began. She loved him dearly, and she did put together a sketchy bits and pieces of information scrapbook. And I have taken that and tried to put together some pieces. And one of the things I discovered when I did a very brief and simple story, that when I share the story, I get to learn more and I get to unravel more. And in the process of all of this unraveling, I discovered that it wasn't just one soldier's story. And there wasn't just one person in trying to understand what his story was all about. But there were many hands and hearts that continued to unravel and understand and explain and explore and discover, so that in 2018 I was able to go to Austria, to Innsbruck, to the mountainside in Volders, to actually see remnants of his B-24 that crashed into the mountain. And it was only because of so many different people with their love and desire to pull together his story that I was able to experience that on what would have been my uncle's 99th birthday. And he was born on D-Day. He didn't make it to 25. So I've been creating a story, and it's called B-24 Forever.
Just another
get
example
back
of
to
how one life affects hundreds and thousands of lives.
Yes.
Thanks for sharing.
Sure.
Any other questions? The B-24 stuff?
Sure.
I can do without the microphone. I think everybody can hear me. Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir.
What did you say? To the end of a book called The Fall of the Fortresses. It was written some time ago by a navigator on a flying fortress that was during the Second World War. And he told of one experience when he came back from one of his runs. He made quite a few runs over Germany. And he found a 20-millimeter shell that was in the wing where the gas tank was. He says he wanted to keep that for a souvenir, as if that shell had gone off, it would have blown the wing off the plane. And you see a lot of the planes going down with the wing blown off. That's a 20-millimeter shell that they have a cap in there that explodes. Well, they emptied the tank when he got back, and he not only found one in there, but there was 11 20 millimeter in the wing, in the gas tank, any one of which could have been blown that wing off. And the ordnance took apart the shells to find out why the shells, the 20 millimeter shells, didn't go off. Well, they took them apart and he couldn't find any caps in there that are exploding. But in one of them, they found a note. And the note was in Czech. And it said, "We're sorry, but this is all we can do for now."
Wow.
And he was thankful that the Czechs sabotaged those shells.
Wow.
Thanks for sharing that. I don't have anything to top that ever. Someone needs to write a book about that.
You said there were 1,800 modifications. How were they discovered that they needed to be upgraded?
Chest flights
Or trial and error, or what was the process of those 18, discovering those 1,800 modifications?
Yeah, I think just operational experience. I know as a submarine force person, we would run into stuff on all of our equipment that was horrible. It would render it inoperative, gas tank valves, propeller, Hamilton standard propeller, feathering stuff. I mean, these are complex pieces of machinery. And so when you think about the number of changes, there's probably times 100 of the things that didn't change. So it wasn't like, oh, a piece of junk. No, they fixed the stuff they needed to improve the operational performance. Probably, all these airplanes were rode hard, put away wet, and that's where you learn what works and what doesn't work. Yeah.
A lot of the mods were what they called theater mods. The planes were built to a spec and then they were flown to a mod center, depending on where they were going to be used. And Marv and I both worked for Northwest. The Northwest Airlines operated a mod center at St. Paul Downtown Airport. And those planes mostly came from Willow Run and they were flown directly from the factory to the mod center, and equipment for the final mission was installed there, and then they were flown into the theaters of combat.
We're going to have a program in July on the modifications.
Okay, great anecdotes here. This one floors me, the 20 millimeter one. Just amazing. Your story is just
It's quite a book.
yeah.
And it was written some time ago by a navigator. It was written by a guy named Elmer Bender, The Fall of the Fortress. And I got about that much stuff to read.
Okay.
But it was
I'm coming over when you're done.
His stories about that he wrote about Schweinfurt was one of the worst, where they went in to bomb the ball bearing factories in Germany. They had to go across most of Germany to get to Schweinfurt. And all they did was bomb these, put the ball bearing factory out of commission for a short while, but 60 of the fortresses never came back out of a 291. And so they didn't get it, all of the ball bearings destroyed. So they went back to get more the factories that were putting them out at Schweinfurt. They lost another 60 B-17 because somebody was a spy in England and telling the Luftwaffe where and when the planes were coming. And they were waiting, most of the Luftwaffe was waiting for them when the second time to Schweinfurt. It's
60 planes and 600 men. Yeah. Thank you. Any other questions, anecdotes, last chance? It's only 1 o'clock.
I'll do one more thing.
I haven't watched all of the Masters of the Air. I think it was in number 2 on the Thursday night events from the Veterans Breakfast Club in Pittsburgh. This guy was talking about that there's a guy on there, brain dead now, who's the expert on the German planes.
Callahan.
Who?
Callahan.
Callahan. He made the point that the reason that we suffered such big losses is the Germans had a system of the planes would take off as they entered the continent, land, refuel, rearm, and take up again. And they would do a kind of a domino, a cascade from one airfield to the other. And I had never heard that aspect before, but said that they would do multiple takeoffs and landings and follow the flight patterns of the bombers coming in. I thought that was a revelation, at least for me.
As long as you've got the microphone, tell them about Jeff's 50. The brass didn't phone. Oh, yeah.
My son was stationed at Ramstein Air Force Base, and I bought a metal detector for my grandson. My son took it away from him. And in that whole area is littered with Roman coins, which he found a bunch of. There's actually collectors. He actually found a couple of Napoleonic coins, silver coins. But they found this one field, and I could bring those sometime. They're going to be donated to the new museum up at Camp Ripley. But he found a bunch of 50 caliber shells, casings, and they were made at the Twin City Arsenal.
Yeah, one of the things I noted in the research for this presentation was when they were in battle against enemy aircraft, they weren't so much concerned, or they were concerned about the incoming rounds, but they were also concerned about the amount of brass casings that were being ejected on the aircraft in front and above them, because it wasn't insignificant, and they could get caught in everything. Yeah, and there was a lot of them. Matter of fact, one of the episodes of Masters of the Air, the pilot, B-17 comes in and they're trying to get the guys out because they're all wounded. And they open the doors and all this brass, just a sea of brass comes out. I thought that was really authentic and scary at the same time. Okay, last chance. Last anecdote or question.
That's a nice picture showing the bomb bay doors there. Did the
Yeah.
wall turret retract? Or?
It did.
Okay.
It was on a crank. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Brock.
Yeah. Well,
That's great. Yeah, go Navy. You know, every time I see a program like this, I realize that Easy Company did not win World War II by itself. If you all know who Easy Company is. Anyway, stay safe, stay healthy. We'll see you next month.